The Geopolitics of Addiction, How War and Drugs Escalate in Response to One Another. Today's presentation, I'm going to provide an overview looking at some historical patterns of war, conflict, trauma, and drugs, going back from the Opium Wars to today. We'll talk about how healing plants have been hijacked for abuse in the emergence since the mid-1800s. We'll look at war-related trauma and substance use. We'll also look at some current patterns of war, conflict, trauma, and drugs with a focus on conflict in the Middle East, looking at the conflict in Myanmar, and then Russia's war in Ukraine. Then we'll wrap up the presentation with looking at some approaches of holistic integrative care for trauma and addiction, building on what's old is new, and the newer approaches touch into some of the oldest patterns and practices. It's a helpful framework as we look at issues of substance use and addiction, where you're probably familiar with the biopsychosocial model, but in this context with geopolitics, we're really looking at biopsycho-sociopolitical framework, where the political aspects of conflict have as much to do with what is happening as do the neurobiological, psychological, and social factors. Another helpful model to look at and examine how these spheres of influence are related and overlapping is when we look at narcotics and cultivation, production, and trafficking and trade of drugs, amass wealth and money through the drug trade and narco-funded wars. But the narco wealth also has influence for corruption, power imbalance, which can lead to declared or undeclared wars, certainly violence and instability, and narco-terrorism. This in turn leads to trauma, suffering, often dislocation. So whether we're talking about a formal war such as what's occurring currently in Gaza, or the Ukraine, where there are dislocation and relocation of individuals suffering with trauma. There's also the dislocation and relocation of people from Central America, Mexico, related to the violence from the cartels and the trauma that this engenders. It's helpful to look at the reasons why people use alcohol and other drugs during wartime or during conflict. One is escapism and disassociation. For those who are actually fighting in the conflict, sometimes it's to stay alert. For those who are fleeing the conflict, it can also be to stay alert, to get rest and to come down, boredom, and then there's often an increase in supply. The reasons for drug cultivation that increase during wartime are that, in part, that there's an increase in demand. Drug cultivation can be a rapid source of funds to support wars, paramilitary groups, and governments. Weakened or divided law enforcement, especially in cases of civil war. There's economic and social turmoil. And in some cases, farmers are compelled to grow illicit drug crops, such as in Myanmar and Afghanistan. The trauma of war cultivates demand for alcohol and other drugs to regulate emotions and energy. Certainly goes without saying, but that war has a catastrophic effect on the health and well-being of nations and its citizens. Conflict causes more mortality and disability than disease. The effects of war include long-term physical and psychological harm to children and adults, and conflict impacts the mental health of societies at large, resulting in a contagion of anxiety, depression, trauma, and often substance use. If we look at historical and contemporary comparison of among American soldiers and some of the differences in terms of the type of conflict that they experience or what they may be exposed to, if we compare a military profile during World War II with the military profile of American soldiers during the U.S.-Vietnam War, we see that the soldiers in the Vietnam era were younger, and on average they saw about 240 days of combat in 1 year. Whereas during World War II, they had longer periods of engagement where they may have been overseas for 4 years, but during those 4 years, they may have only seen 40 days of combat. And I say only just as a comparison. 1 day of combat is plenty. Now, if we look at some information about looking at the understanding of how we recognize now what has been a human phenomenon for centuries, the recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder resulted from the post-Vietnam veterans' experiences. And the formal diagnosis really wasn't established until about 1980. However, it's been certainly something that has affected people. So the main symptoms of traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder are listed here. There are 5 types of clusters. One is re-experiencing or reliving the events, sometimes known as flashbacks, negative thinking and mood, avoiding situations, and this can be avoiding places or people related to the traumatic event. It can also be avoiding situations and avoiding people because interpersonal interactions are too taxing. Emotional numbing, so suppressing of thoughts or feelings, and also hyperarousal or feeling keyed up, easily startled, reactive, sometimes physically violent or argumentative. So what are some of the ways that are reliable to manage these clusters of symptoms? Alcohol and other substances are a reliable and predictable way of certainly numbing oneself, altering one's mood, shutting down your cognition. Not healthy, but reliable. And so it is understandable how this can become a default means of how humans respond to, deal with, or manage traumatic stress. This is an image of a brain, and I have here highlighted brain regions and areas that are involved in traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress, and also key areas of the brain that are involved in addiction. So all of these areas, both the ones in red and black, are involved in traumatic stress when we look at symptomology and areas of activation or changes in terms of wiring and firing, with the exception perhaps of the ventral tegmental area. The areas in red are involved in both addiction and traumatic stress. And here we see the ventral tegmental area that is highlighted, that's in green, is the area that is more uniquely associated with areas of addiction. What's important to note here is how much overlap there is in the two areas. So when we look at someone using a psychoactive substance, the fact that it crosses the blood-brain barrier and affects the functioning of the individual and also affects their brain and neuroanatomy, you can see that there's a lot of overlap here. It's also helpful to look at from a larger kind of scoping out with a bit more of a wide angle lens, is looking at how stress, and when we talk about stress, this can be traumatic stress as well as the obvious stress that's caused by conflict, how it affects people not only during the time of the conflict, but in some long-term and lasting ways. So stress can change gene expression, and stress hormones modify RNA and DNA in the brain and cause changes in gene expression. These are known as epigenetic modifications. And so one way of understanding this is that we see that from the strand here of DNA, where there are epigenetic modifications that can be switched on and switched off in terms of certain markers, activating or deactivating functionality of certain things. And this can be changes that can occur during your lifetime, but are also genetic markers and changes that can be passed on to one's offspring. And there are some particular markers. So if we look at chronic exposure to stress hormones, it can increase gene associated with PTSD and mood disorders. You'll see it listed here as FKBP5. These epigenetic changes can directly impact depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other anxiety disorders. Non-genetic inheritance of traits associated with parental exposure to trauma and stress. So if we look at epigenetic or transgenerational changes, are directly relevant to depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other anxiety disorders. The other thing to keep in mind too is that fear, anxiety, and aggression can be contagious, not in a genetic way per se, but can be contagious in that it can easily impact a family system, a community, a society. And the stress and trauma impact organizations, individuals, and subsequent generations. If we look back at historically, the three primary psychoactive substances that have been used were derived from cannabis, the coca plant, and the opium poppy. So we're looking at heroin, morphine, opium, and the derivatives. Cannabis in its plant-based form, and then coca being extracted to cocaine. So in their more pure forms or the more plant-based forms, these have been used pharmaceutically, historically, in modest amounts for health benefits, with everything from adjusting to altitude to pain management, antidiarrheal, and sleep aids, pain assistance, and the like. So historically, these are the substances that we've focused on, and once they became more synthesized, from coca being processed into cocaine, the opium poppy being processed into heroin, then we began to see issues with addiction and changes in terms of their use and properties. So if we go all the way back to the Opium Wars in the 1800s, when the British Empire forced the sale and trade of opium in China in an effort to try to open up international trade between the East and West. If we look here at the graph on the right-hand side of your screen, we can see the increasing amount of opium imported in tons per year going from 1830 through the end of the Second Opium War in 1860. Obviously, this shows how there's a significant escalation and increase in terms of drug importation into a country that's being affected by war. And for China, the Opium War resulted in addiction, the indignity of defeat, unequal trade treaties that continue to complicate China's relationship with the West even today. These are some images from the Opium War, where the trauma of the Opium Wars increased vulnerability for addiction and drug use. So we had the country flooded with thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of opium per year. And not only was it clearly an addictive substance flooding the country, but you can see from the images in the upper right or upper left-hand corner here that the population was slaughtered and traumatized, and resulting in substantial amounts of addiction. These are some images from the U.S. Civil War, which was taking place in the time period just after the end of the Second Opium War. And on the field here, we see that the dead and dying are fellow countrymen that are scattered around the fields following a conflict. And what's important here to note, and is also relevant for wars today, is that the people have to go out and clear the dead from the land after a battle is over. And we know now from the work with veterans with traumatic stress that handling human remains is associated with significant amounts of trauma and traumatic stress. And so for the dead and dying, people need to or learn to physically and emotionally numb themselves and handle them like cattle at a slaughterhouse. And this is true. Often we may forget too that it's not only in times of war and conflict, but many of the more traumatic and troublesome experiences of first responders arriving to horrific situations of human catastrophe are also often faced with these types of challenges. These are some images from, again, the U.S. Civil War, and we look at the crude surgical procedures that were used at the time. So we see not a scalpel, but we see a saw. So when people were shot, and the concern or the fear of gangrene setting in and infection, they would often have their limbs amputated. And so this required significant pain management. So morphine was used at the time. And following the Civil War, that was the first opiate epidemic in the United States, where not only the soldiers who were sent home with morphine kits for pain management, but it also bled over into society. The trauma of the American Civil War increased vulnerability for substance abuse and addiction. And it was also just following the Civil War when we began to make a move away from sort of the plant-based whole plants that were used for medically to the more processed, highly concentrated forms of medications, and the emergence of major pharmacies and the pharmaceutical industry as well. If we look then to World War II, there was an understanding, or history shows us, that all sides of the fighting for both the Nazis as well as the Allied forces used heavy amounts of amphetamines to stay alert and have energy for prolonged wars in the field. This is a memo from now moving past World War II into the 50s with the first initial establishment of the CIA, where the CIA was actually testing the use of psychedelic drugs like LSD as potential agents of war. Psychedelics emerged in the 60s as part of the counter movement, the counterculture movement, the peace movement, and in a response against war. Interestingly, most of the leaders of the peace movement were first exposed to LSD through the experimentation that the CIA was doing, where they were recruiting college students at Stanford and in the Boston area and Chicago area for studies and tests involving LSD. These experiences were profound for many of those people, and they went on to learn how to synthesize it themselves. And once it became part of the counterculture and the peace movement, that's when they became illegal. Interestingly, we are now experiencing somewhat of a renaissance, some call it the psychedelic renaissance, now in the 2020s, that's been led by the need to find effective PTSD treatments for veterans. So there have been clinical trials conducted with the plant-based hallucinogens like psilocybin, as well as some of the synthetic hallucinogens or synthetic psychedelics like MDMA and ketamine for the treatment of PTSD with veterans, as well as survivors of interpersonal violence and sexual assault. This has led to the legalization of the use of these drugs for research and to understand how these substances may be effective in treating suicidality, depression, and PTSD. It's also led to the decriminalization of these drugs in several states. The legalization of ketamine for depression, trauma in most states, where people can now order it online for home delivery, and the movement towards a different relationship with these powerful substances, all stemming out of the Cold War and the war in the 60s. Here we see a commander, Vietnam veteran Army Commander Perry Parks, who led many of the efforts for legalization of cannabis for veterans with PTSD. His experience trying to manage stress and trauma after the Vietnam War were partly informed by some of the research that was conducted by Raphael Mechoulam in Israel, where he identified and isolated the compounds in cannabis to understand how it works, and found that it was helpful for survivors of the Holocaust for dealing with trauma and PTSD. Out of that research, they've identified THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which is an exogenous cannabinoid, and found that it mirrors in shape and form an endogenous neurotransmitter that humans have called anandamide. So anandamide is an endogenous cannabinoid neurotransmitter. And both anandamide and THC help to facilitate forgetting, which is believed to be part of cannabis's therapeutic effect for traumatic stress, helping to facilitate forgetting. In the 60s and 70s, drug use was synonymous with the peace movement and counterculture in direct response or against the Vietnam War. Social turmoil and the Vietnam War protests and dropping out of society's social norms were coupled with an escalation of drug use. These are some images from the 1960s and early 70s. We see a soldier with his gun at his side. He was snorting some heroin in Vietnam. We see some young soldiers smoking cannabis through a gun in the field. And then we see a picture of protests at home in the U.S. Drop acid, not bombs. And so these crossovers connect the important connection where we first began to really see a strong synergy in both society as well as in the battlefield with war and drugs. When we look at the cultivation synergies, we see there's increased demand and also an increase in supply. Here we're looking at some graphs from some research, some older research of mine in a book that's looking at the increase in opium cultivation, opium being used to produce heroin in Myanmar, or it was called Burma at the time, we see in the top graph. And then we see the bottom graph where we see the increase in cultivation of opium in Laos. So this was the area that has become known as the Golden Triangle and is reactivated today during the following the military coup in Myanmar and the civil unrest that is established there. So if we look at in the Golden Triangle opium cultivation in the 60s and 70s, the areas here that are highlighted in green, the darker colors, are where there was higher levels of poppy cultivation. But we see that these areas, particularly in Burma, are still very active today. And the production in Myanmar has surged to a 9-year high, following again the military coup in 2021. Some farmers choose opium cultivation due to the economic disruption, and others may be forced by militia to cultivate opium. This graph here shows a longer vision or understanding from the early 1930s and 40s on the far left-hand side of the screen up through today in Myanmar following the coup. And you see that there was still the highest production of opium in the area was during the Vietnam War. It dropped off precipitously, and then it has begun to escalate again following the military coup. What's important to note is that the opium isn't used, does not retain its use and trafficking only in Myanmar. It's trafficked out of the country by and large for the development of funds for groups that are trying to counter the military junta. This is a graph looking at the similar time frame from 1940 to 2022 in neighboring Laos. And again, the peak time of cultivation in Laos was during the Vietnam War. These are some more contemporary images at the Golden Triangle, where they're still trying to manage the proliferation of opium in the area. These are some pictures that I took when I was in the area in 2020, and you can see the signage that and the concerns around heroin and drug trafficking and munitions are still quite substantive. This again really rose out during the Vietnam War. Here we see opium production in the Golden Triangle, present day, and as well as also the Golden Crescent, which has been in Afghanistan, which has somewhat changed now with shift from in the Taliban stance on opium production. In the 80s, we had the Iran-Contra affair in which the U.S. was providing some cover to and support for the Contras in Nicaragua in their efforts to fight communism. And during that time period, there was a blind eye turned to some of the cocaine that was coming into the United States in trafficking. And the data here looks at, by age group, the percentage of the U.S. population that was using cocaine in the late 70s, early 80s, and we see that it was pretty substantial. Following the time that the light came to the light of public awareness of the Iran-Contra affair and the open shipments of and trafficking of cocaine into the United States by some of those routes had changed, we saw that there was a substantive decline in the percentage of the U.S. population that was using cocaine. And we see here a direct impact of how these policies can play out in a country. With the Afghan wars, the cultivation and production of opium has been long and complex. Particularly, we were more aware of what's been happening from the 1980s during the Soviet conflict in Afghanistan, when production of opium was being used to counter and fight against the presence of the Soviets. And then this has continued in ebbs and flows from that time period through today. This graph here shows the opium production in tons in Afghanistan going from the 1970s up through the invasion with the Soviets in the 80s. It then declined very precipitously in 2001 as the Taliban was suppressing cultivation in an effort to try to be recognized as a legitimate force in the world. Following 9/11 in 2001, with the post 9/11 invasion into Afghanistan, we see a substantial increase in the production of opium in Afghanistan, and this was in with full approval from the Taliban, and again, that was used as funding for a devastated economy, as well as to fight against the troops that were in Afghanistan. That dropped off pretty substantively following the U.S. withdrawal, and then most recently the Taliban has suppressed the production, and we see a huge decline in cultivation. We don't know what effect this will have on the global market, because we have seen where opium production is being ramped up in Myanmar, but there's also now a global shift away from the plant-based psychoactive substances to more synthetics. This is an image showing some of the outflows of heroin and opium paste and base from Afghanistan to other parts of the world. And again, we see what happens not just in the country where the cultivation is taking place, but these outflows go out into the globe and affect many other societies. There's in Afghanistan as well, if we look at the human face of the drug problem, it's present in Moscow, London, Oslo, Paris, really around the world, as well as in Kandahar. It's easy and cheap to get access to it within the country. Decades of war-related trauma have affected the citizens of Afghanistan. And there's an estimate that about 8% of the population age 15 to 64 in Afghanistan is addicted to opium or its derivatives. And that's more than twice the global average. These are some images of some young children using opium, smoking opium. And we have a grandfather giving it to his grandson. We have some mothers who are using it with their children there. And if you watch the videos, you can see where they're, sometimes will blow it into the child's face in an effort to just keep the child quiet and calm. These are some prescription pill bottles that a former student of mine who was a military veteran that served in Afghanistan and Iraq shared with me. And he, through his participation in a mindfulness-based stress reduction program that we had, he said that he was able to stop using all of these prescriptions, and these are what were provided to him through his medical care at the VA. He would have some for pain management, some for sleep, some to counter symptoms of depression and anxiety, others to counter the effects of those medications. And on a daily basis, he was taking all of these various pills, and he said he was able to stop taking them thanks to his practice in mindfulness-based stress reduction. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, if you're not familiar with it, is a ancient practice of using Buddhist psychology and meditation that has been developed into sort of a practice and a curriculum by Jon Kabat-Zinn and others for a more widespread adaptation and use. It is very trans-therapeutic and beneficial. If we look at opioid prescription and addiction overdose risks among veterans following the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, many of the soldiers that were using the medications were given them for pain and physical ailments, but they also found that this helped them in terms of numbing themselves emotionally. So it relieved anxiety and emotional distress, as well as physical pain, which had been a recipe for addiction and in some cases overdose. This is a graph that shows the numbers of U.S. Veterans and military personnel who were admitted for heroin and opioid treatment going from early around the year 2000 up through 2016 when the data was last available. And where you see the red arrow here, we see that that's when the troop levels started to decline, and we saw a substantive drop also in terms of the number of veterans who are coming in for treatment for addiction because of prescription opioid dependency. At that same time, though, we start to see an uptick in terms of the blue lines represent the numbers of veterans that were coming in for treatment for heroin. So also an opiate, but switching from the prescription to the heroin as the legislation began to start to tighten up on the accessibility to the prescription opioids. And these two shapes that we see here, so the orange bell-shaped curve is looking at the troop levels that were deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the blue line shows the timing and the numbers of veterans and military personnel admitted to treatment for a substance use disorder. And we can see that they follow some similar patterns and paths. If we look at more contemporary issues related to conflicts, global conflicts, we see that drugs and war in Syria, Lebanon, and the Middle East are influencing the trafficking and cultivation, particularly of a drug called Captagon, which is an synthetic amphetamine. And in this context, we see again that cycle of narcotics cultivation, production, and trafficking, amassing money through the drug trade and drug trafficking for narco influence that then corrupts and destabilizes governments and systems, and that fosters instability, narco-terrorism, war and violence, which then cultivates trauma and dislocation. So the drug Captagon, which is prevalent in the Middle East, has been used, has funded the Syrian war, and has also funded Hezbollah, and has been used by Hamas during the October 7th attacks in Israel. There's a nexus of conflict, drug trafficking, and violence fueled by Captagon as well. So, and here we can see some images of how it is trafficked and shipped around the region inside of everything from biscuits and cookies to oranges, and has been also engaged with and found to have involvement from a prince in Saudi Arabia, as well as the regime in Syria. So we're looking at people in positions of authority and power, and it's also funded the ISIS, the Assad regime, and Hezbollah. This is some information if we're looking at how we've come to understand the use of this very powerful and potent stimulant drug, and the role that is played in supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Syrian regime. And interrogations and court documents indicate that the syndicates operating between the Assad family, the Syrian army, have helped to fuel the production, movement, and trafficking of Captagon and similar stimulants. In Ukraine, in the Ukrainian war, we're seeing evolving trends in relation to drug use and drug trafficking in and around Ukraine. And if we think back to the beginning of the presentation about the reasons why people use drugs during wartime and what the connection is between demand and supply, what we're really seeing a lot of here in Ukraine is the emergence of synthetic drugs made within the country with precursor chemicals that are coming in from outside of the country. And in Ukraine, the drug demand on the one hand is cannabis for stress and trauma, cocaine and amphetamines for attention, focus, and energy, and opioids for pain, both physical and psychological. The drugs that are available in Ukraine, cannabis, cocaine, although not too much, that's somewhat difficult to get through the lines. Synthetic drug production and trafficking has increased substantially, though, and the final products that are available are alpha PVP, methadone, and methadone as well. And the war deepens the suffering for people with drug addiction in Ukraine. The usual routes of medical care for people who do have addiction has been declined by diversion of medical staff to treat and deal with the most urgent and pressing physical needs of troops and people affected by conflict. And there's also a decrease in terms of capacity and availability for opioid-assisted treatment and supply medications for addiction treatment. At the same time, there's an increase in demand because people are suffering and traumatized and trying to manage their substance use through the use of psychoactive substances, including alcohol. What we are now seeing, as I had alluded to before, is that mindfulness-based practices for addiction recovery and to help support people in the helping professions are helping in this time of war and conflict. Mindfulness is transtherapeutic and can mitigate the adverse psychological and physical symptoms for both people working in the addictions workforce and people with addictions by addressing the stress surfeit, distress intolerance, motivational factors, fatigue. The key elements of mindfulness-based practices include meditation for attentional focus, awareness of breath, body scanning, somatic experiencing, and yoga, which integrates our somatic engagement of the mind, body, and breath. And together, these practices are designed to help cultivate awareness of physical sensations, interoception of attention to visceral bodily sensations, awareness of thoughts and behaviors, personal insight, and intentional physiological rest and restoration. The science of mindfulness-based practices show that it's clinically relevant in changing neural networks involved in stress and addictive behaviors. It can help to reduce physiological stress arousal. It can mediate and moderate traumatic stress symptoms. It can cultivate cognitive and behavioral skills for the management of addictive behaviors and stress. The foundations of mindfulness-based approaches to recovery, we see that the development of the capacity to investigate our own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors help in terms of reducing reactivity to distressing thoughts and emotions, fostering distress tolerance. This is important for practitioners, people working in the addictions workforce, as well as for the patients and the people that we work with who are suffering with addictions. It increases cognitive and attentional control, helps to mitigate stress reactivity, change the function of neural pathways that are underlying the stress and addictive behaviors. Research has shown that mindfulness-based interventions can help to foster self-regulation, reduce traumatic stress symptoms, decouple stress reactivity and craving neurocircuitry, and change brain regions that are correlated with greater attentional control decreasing stress response and cravings. Self-regulation is essential for distress tolerance, managing of cravings, fostering mental well-being, whereas poor self-regulation increases the development of addictive behaviors. This little illustration here shows us how the brain circuits become wired together in under conditions of trauma, stress, and addictions. The thalamus regulates sensory input. The amygdala is sort of like a security guard, always on alert for potential threats. And they become overly reactive and sort of tied together in that they wire and fire together. What happens in this case is that we develop strong neural networks between thalamus and amygdala, but we have weaker connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus, thus often misinterpreting sensory cues and input. And the stress response becomes amplified in people with addictions and trauma, affecting both addictions workforce personnel and our patients. Mindfulness-based practices have been shown to make changes in the brain whereby the thalamus and the prefrontal cortex become more strongly linked together. Rather than reacting to sensory input automatically without awareness, we are able to respond, consider what the thoughts, feelings, and sensations are. And this mindful attention helps to reduce cravings, neural activity, and functional connectivity in craving-related areas of the brain. Through repeated practice, we develop what we call positive neuroadaptation, in that in response to the triggers or stressors, we are able to consider what this actually means and choose healthier, more positive responses to those triggers and cues. Mindful training breaks the link between the urge and action. Locating the sensations in our body that are at the root of craving, stress, can help be a helpful way of applying practical skills of mindfulness. And here we're going to look at and learn a little bit about mindful surfing. So we can't stop the waves of what is coming towards us, but we can learn to surf thoughts, sensations, emotions, and cravings. We'll walk through a little bit about what this experience is. We'll begin by locating the sensations of craving in the body, exploring where one can feel it, where is it located, noticing each place in the body where it's felt. Choosing one of the strongest sensations to work with, paying close attention to it, being as specific as possible, taking a deep interest in it, can help us then to gain some objectivity and distance from these sensations. Notice what happens. Does the sensation intensify or diminish? Is the location constant or does it travel? And what research shows us is that by using these techniques, we can decrease the intensity of thoughts, emotions, and sensations. We can also decrease the intensity of cravings. So using what's known as the RAIN technique, which is recognize, accept or allow, investigate, and notice what is happening, we find that the intensity of cravings become less and less with each subsequent wave of craving. So the diagram here on the left side of your screen shows an illustration of the period of time in which a craving may exist, usually about 20 minutes or so, and the decrease in intensity that research shows us people experience when they have applied the mindfulness skills of observing, not just suppressing the craving or the intense feelings and emotions, but allowing them and investigating them. and noticing that they do dissipate over time. It is out of this very ground of suffering that we can contemplate well-being, and it's in the muddy waters that the lotus grows and blooms. These words can be helpful for us to remind how, out of suffering, our own or that of the clients that we work with, we can become stronger and beautiful things can emerge.